Nathan's voice slashed through the air like a whip, sharp and merciless. Heads turned. Conversations halted. The heavy silence on the crowded bus made the words hit even harder. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a cold artificial glow on the rows of weary passengers. Outside, the rain battered against the windows, a rhythmic pounding that should have drowned out the ugliness in his tone. But it didn't. Nothing could. His mother flinched, but didn't look up. Instead, she clutched the worn-out bag in her trembling hands, gripping it as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Her shoulders sagged, her frail frame seeming smaller under the weight of humiliation. Nathan, arms crossed tightly over his chest, let out a sharp sigh, shaking his head in open disgust. "You can't even handle one simple thing." His voice dripped with irritation, each syllable carved from impatience. "How do you mess up something this basic?" His words weren't just frustration. They were an attack, a calculated, deliberate cut meant to wound, and they did. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke, no one interfered. They all felt the tension thickening in the air, suffocating and inescapable. But silence was easier. At the back of the bus, sitting in a seat partially hidden in the shadows, a figure watched, unmoving, unshaken. His presence was quiet, but there was something about him, something different. And though Nathan had no idea yet, his night was about to take a turn he would never forget. The bus continued to move forward, the dim overhead lights flickering as it rolled through the rain-soaked streets. The rhythmic hum of the engine mingled with the steady patter of rain on the windows, a dull, hypnotic sound that should have made the ride peaceful, but inside there was no peace, only a tension so thick it was suffocating. Passengers hunched in their seats, some bathed in the glow of their phone screens, others staring out at the drenched cityscape. The air smelled of damp fabric and fatigue, the kind of feeling that often clung to latecomers who just wanted to get home. Nathan's voice had broken the uncomfortable silence once before, and when he shifted his weight, crossing his arms, frustration bubbling just below the surface, everyone on the bus could feel it coming. And then it did. Nathan's jaw clenched as he exhaled sharply, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "Are you serious, Mom?" His voice was a low hiss, laced with frustration. "You forgot it? Again?" His mother, still clutching her worn-out bag, glanced up with tired eyes. "I thought I put it in before we left, sweetheart. Maybe it's—" "No, stop," Nathan cut her off, his words slicing through the air like a blade. "You always do this, every single time. It's the same excuse." She opened her mouth to speak, but he wasn't done. Nathan's voice grew sharper, his irritation spilling over into outright hostility. "You know what your problem is? You never take responsibility. That's why everything is such a mess. That's why Dad left you." The words landed like a punch to the gut. His mother stiffened but said nothing. She only lowered her gaze, gripping the bag tighter, as if trying to hold herself together. His mother stiffened but said nothing. She only lowered her gaze, gripping the bag tighter, as if trying to hold herself together. The weight of Nathan's words settled over the bus like a thick fog, heavy, suffocating, inescapable. Though no one spoke, the tension was palpable, stretching across the dimly lit space like an invisible force. A teenage girl sitting a few rows ahead shifted in her seat, glancing at her friend with wide eyes before discreetly raising her phone. "This is going viral," she whispered, her fingers poised over the record button. An older man near the front tugged the brim of his cap lower, his jaw tightening as he stared at the floor. He clenched his fists, but he didn't turn around. A middle-aged woman sitting beside her husband let out a sharp breath, shaking her head in disgust. "How can he talk to his own mother like that?" she muttered under her breath. And yet no one said a word. Nathan's voice had silenced them all. Not because they agreed, but because speaking up meant stepping into the storm. Shame and fear outweighed their outrage. At the back of the bus, a lone figure watched, his expression unreadable. His posture was relaxed, almost indifferent, but his eyes told a different story. He was waiting. The bus jolted as it rounded a corner, sending a shudder through the passengers. Nathan's mother, already unsteady, reached for the nearest seat to keep from falling. Her frail hands gripped the metal pole, her knuckles whitening as she steadied herself. Nathan scoffed. "See? You can't even handle that." His voice was laced with mockery, his arms still crossed as he shook his head. "It's always me who has to fix everything. Always." A few passengers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but silent. A young man near the aisle frowned, his fingers tightening around his phone, but he quickly looked away. Nathan's mother swallowed hard, still avoiding his gaze. "Nathan, please, no!" He cut her off again, his voice bitter. "I don't want to hear it." From the back of the bus, a presence stirred. The moment was coming, a movement, subtle yet commanding. At the back of the bus, a man who had been sitting quietly finally rose from his seat. His steps were slow, deliberate, yet they seemed to echo louder than the hum of the engine. As he moved down the aisle, the dim bus lights illuminated his face, and murmurs rippled through the passengers. It was Keanu Reeves. Nathan, still seething, barely registered the shift in atmosphere at first. He had been too absorbed in his anger, in his need to assert control, to care about anyone else's reaction. But the murmurs? Those, he noticed. The way people suddenly turned toward the approaching figure, that he couldn't ignore. Frowning, he turned his head, his eyes locking onto the man now standing just a few steps away. Keanu's expression was calm, almost too calm. But behind that tranquility was something else. A weight, a knowing, a quiet but undeniable authority that made the air feel different. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, firm, yet eerily gentle. "The words you speak today may be the last your mother remembers of you." The bus fell into a dead silence. Nathan blinked, caught off guard by the stranger's words. He scoffed, trying to mask the sudden unease creeping into his chest. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "Who the hell are you?" Keanu didn't flinch. His posture remained relaxed, his gaze unwavering. "I'm just another passenger," he said, simply. "Like everyone else here. But unlike you, I see what's happening." Nathan let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, do you? Great. Another person who thinks they know everything." Keanu took a slow step forward. Not threatening, not aggressive, just undeniably present. "I don't need to know everything," he said. "I don't need to know your history, your past, or your pain. What I do know is that right now, in this moment, you're choosing to destroy the one person who has likely given everything for you." Nathan stiffened. "You don't—" Keanu didn't let him finish. "Look at her." The words were simple, but the way he said them left no room for argument. Nathan hesitated, then almost unwillingly he turned his head toward his mother. She still clutched her bag, her knuckles white from how tightly she held it. She didn't meet his gaze. Her shoulders trembled just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough. Enough for him to feel something he hadn't expected. Guilt. Keanu's voice broke through the thick air again. "Do you think this is the first time she's felt this pain? Do you think it started here, on this bus?" Nathan's throat tightened, but he forced himself to keep his expression unreadable. "She always messes things up," he muttered, though there was less conviction in his tone. "I have to clean up after her." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "And how many times has she cleaned up after you?" Nathan flinched. "How many times," Keanu continued, "has she stayed up at night worrying about you? How many sacrifices has she made that you'll never even know about?" Nathan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Keanu let the silence stretch. Then, with quiet intensity, he spoke again. "You're angry. I get that. But anger doesn't give you the right to tear apart the person who carried you when you were weak." Nathan clenched his jaw. His hands curled into fists, not out of defiance, but because something inside him was breaking. Keanu's voice softened slightly, but his words were no less powerful. "One day, she won't be here. One day, you'll wake up and realize you can't take these words back." The weight of that truth slammed into Nathan harder than any insult ever could. The bus was silent, not the kind of silence that followed cruelty, but the kind that came when something had changed. Nathan stared at his mother, his anger melting into something else, something raw, something painful. Keanu took a step back, his job done. "You still have time," he said, his voice quieter now. "What you do with it is up to you." And then, just like that, he waited. Would Nathan take the chance? Would he make the choice before it was too late? The entire bus held its breath. Nathan sat frozen. The echoes of Keanu's words rang in his ears, louder than the hum of the bus engine, louder than the rain hammering against the windows. "One day she won't be here. One day you'll wake up and realize you can't take these words back." His throat felt tight. His hands, still clenched, loosened ever so slightly. He looked at his mother, truly looked at her, for the first time in what felt like years. She had always seemed smaller lately, more fragile. He had chalked it up to age, but now, in this moment, he realized it was something else. It was exhaustion. It was years of carrying everything alone. The tension in the bus hadn't faded, but it had shifted. No longer the weight of hostility. It was now anticipation, awaiting silence. Nathan swallowed hard, his mind racing through memories he had buried beneath his resentment. The nights she stayed up with him when he was sick. The mornings she woke before dawn to make sure he had something to eat before school. The times she shielded him from arguments, from disappointment, from the harshness of the world. And how had he repaid her? By lashing out, by blaming her for his frustrations, his failures, by making her feel worthless in front of a bus full of strangers. His mother still wasn't looking at him. She kept her eyes down, her fingers gripping her worn-out bag as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the moment. Nathan inhaled shakily. "Mom?" His voice was hoarse, unfamiliar. She didn't react at first. Maybe she didn't believe he was actually speaking to her with anything but anger. He swallowed and tried again. "Mom, look at me." Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her gaze. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, met his. There was no accusation in them, no resentment, just a deep, quiet sadness. Nathan felt something in his chest tighten painfully. He faltered. How could he possibly undo what he had just done? How could he take back years of bitterness in a single moment? But Keanu's words lingered. "You still have time." So, he did the only thing he could. "I'm sorry." His mother blinked, as if she hadn't heard him correctly. Nathan exhaled, his voice raw, unsteady. "I mean it, Mom. I'm sorry for the way I talked to you, for the way I've been treating you. You didn't deserve that." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she said nothing. Instead, she reached out, her frail fingers resting lightly over his hand. It was the smallest gesture, yet it sent a wave of relief and guilt crashing through him all at once. He squeezed her hand gently. "I'll do better, I swear." The silence in the bus had changed again, no longer awkward, no longer tense. It was something else now, something like hope. The atmosphere inside the bus had shifted. The weight of cruelty and shame had been lifted, replaced by something softer, something unspoken but deeply felt. Nathan still held his mother's hand, his grip tight but gentle, as if afraid she might pull away. But she didn't. She simply sat there, her fingers laced with his, her expression unreadable. The moment stretched between them, delicate yet powerful. From the back of the bus, Keanu Reeves watched in silence. His job here was done. Without a word, he turned toward the exit, stepping forward just as the bus began to slow. Nathan looked up just in time to see him passing by. Their eyes met for a brief second. Keanu gave him the smallest of nods, a silent acknowledgement, a message only they understood. Nathan swallowed and nodded back. "Thank you." His voice was barely above a whisper, but Keanu heard it. He didn't reply. As the bus came to a halt, Keanu stepped off into the rainy night, disappearing into the glow of the streetlights. Nathan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His mother shifted beside him, still quiet. Then, with a small, almost hesitant smile, she gently rested her head against his shoulder. For the first time in years, Nathan didn't pull away. Instead, he let her. The quiet inside the bus felt different now. No longer the silence of shame, but the kind that comes after something important, something life-changing. Across the aisle, the teenage girl who had been recording earlier lowered her phone. She stared at the screen for a moment, then, without a word, she tapped delete. A middle-aged woman sitting near the window reached for her purse, pulling out her phone. With a shaky breath, she dialed a number she hadn't called in too long. "Mom," she said softly, I just wanted to check in." Near the front, the older man with the cap let out a quiet sigh. He stared out at the rain-soaked streets, his fingers loosening on his cane. His mind drifted back to a conversation he wished he could have one more time. Everyone on that bus had witnessed something tonight. Some would forget it by morning, but others would carry it with them. Nathan turned back to his mother, looking at her, not as a burden, not as someone to blame, but as a woman who had always been there for him, even when he didn't deserve it. He squeezed her hand a little tighter. "I love you, Mom." Her eyes shimmered as she looked up at him. "I love you too, Nathan." And just like that, the journey continued. Not just the one on the bus, but the one between them. A journey toward healing, toward understanding, toward something better.